On the same morning, in two different parts of India, two girls are born. One is born in a village in Bundelkhand in central India. Her mother walked 4 kilometers to reach the nearest clinic. Her school has one teacher for 3 grades, taught together in one single room. The nearest job that pays the same wage on the same day every month is a bus ride away. And that's only applicable if the bus actually ends up coming to the bus stop. The other is born 1100 kilometers south in an apartment in Bangalore. Her parents work in the software industry that turned the city into one of the world's most major tech hubs. Her school has a library and classrooms that actually function. Her family will earn several times fold what the first girl's family goes on to earn this year. Neither girl has done anything yet. They haven't studied, worked, saved, or even failed at anything. And yet, their odds of finishing school, their income at 40, even how long each one of these girls will go on to live, all of it is already pulling apart even before either of them can begin walking. This video isn't about these two girls. It's about the distance opening up between them and about a fundamentally harder question. Not why is India poor, but why a country capable of doing astonishing things can't close a gap like this one. That's the puzzle this video sets out to solve. India isn't a poor country anymore, and that's exactly what makes this video even harder to explain. Folks, let's start with what India has actually built. In the year 2023, India landed a spacecraft near the moon's south pole, something that no country had done before. Every month, Indians make more digital payments than any other country on this planet. Over 20 billion of them, and a street vendor and essentially a customer can go on to settle a transaction in under 2 seconds with no card, no fee, and no bank visit. By 2025, according to the International Monetary Fund and India's own year end accounting, India had surpassed Japan to become the world's fourth largest economy. And it's actually growing faster than the three economies ahead of it. Almost any one of those would go on to become a headline in any other country in the world. India essentially has all three, and yet roughly 130 million Indians still live in extreme poverty. The average Indian's income still ranks below more than 100 other countries. So here's the question, and this video won't pretend to already have answer to that question. The question is, how does a country that can reach to the moon and run the world's most advanced payment network still have so many citizens who can't reliably feed, treat, or educate their own families? The easy answers actually don't survive contact with the actual evidence. India hasn't failed to grow. It's grown for 3 decades and it's also sped up very recently. There's no single policy, political party, or villain behind this. Any YouTuber or any YouTube channel that is actually offering this perspective to you is actually selling you something simpler than the ground reality. Here's what's actually happening. Every country is solving two different problems. The first is making the economy bigger. The second is making sure that the bigger economy reaches an actual person's life, meaning their kitchen table, their child's classroom, and their parents' hospital bed. In the last 30 years, India has become spectacularly good at the first problem. This video is about the second one, the slower one, the one that doesn't move at the same speed as gross domestic product, no matter how fast the GDP actually goes on to grow. Before we go any further, we need a better word than poor. Economists argue constantly over where exactly to draw the poverty line. Depending which line you pick, India's remaining poverty can look like a small shrinking problem or a very large one. And this is using the same data. It's a real argument, but it's not the most useful one. The most useful distinction is this: the difference between being poor and being fragile. Now, just to give you a stat, and this is actually very interesting, Over the last decade, something like a quarter of a billion Indians crossed out of the most severe deprivation, one of the fastest poverty reductions any country has ever gone to record. But crossing that line isn't the same as crossing into security. It just means a family that had almost nothing now has just enough, as long as nothing actually goes wrong. One bad monsoon, one hospitalization, one lost season of wages for a huge number of Indian families, any one of those things can easily erase a decade of progress in one single year or sheer one single development. This is the story that poverty statistics don't actually tell you on their own. It isn't about how many people are poor right now, that's not the point. It's actually about how many people are one bad month away from being poor again, and that number is actually far larger than the poverty rate alone goes on to suggest. For most of the last 2000 years, the Indian subcontinent wasn't a poor or peripheral economy. From roughly the first century through the early 1700s, it produced close to a quarter of everything that the world actually made, according to economic historian Angus Madison, a figure who is now cited across the political spectrum, including by an Indian Prime Minister addressing Oxford. Across 2 centuries of colonial rule, that share collapsed to around 4% by 1950. Historians still disagree on how much of that was actually deliberate policy and how much was simply the rest of the world industrializing faster. Both readings go on to use the same data, and reasonable people land in different arguments. What isn't a dispute is the outcome itself, because for the last 2 centuries, the income of an ordinary person who's living in India barely moved, while it rose several fold in many countries around the world. India went on to enter independence in 1947 and being tagged among the poorest countries on earth by any measure anyone was actually using. What came next was a choice, not an accident. India's new government decided that the state and not the market would actually go on to decide who built what. Opening or expanding a factory required government permission and sometimes dozens of separate approvals. Picture an entire country's economy steered from a single control room, one dial at a time, where millions of drivers wait for someone else to actually go on to turn on their key. And for nearly 4 decades, that's roughly how it worked. Growth stayed stuck around 3.5% a year. Economists hung an unkind, inaccurate nickname on it, one that blamed culture for what was actually a poor policy choice. The turning point wasn't just an idea, it was actually a crisis. By June 1991, India had enough foreign currency left to cover barely 2 weeks of import. The government physically flew its gold reserves to London as collateral for an emergency loan to avoid any default. Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao and his Finance Minister Manmohan Singh used that emergency as a cover to do what no government had the political room to do in 4 decades: hand the keys back. They dismantled most of the licensing system, cut tariffs, and let millions of small decisions replace one big one. What followed was 3 decades of accelerating growth, the growth that by 2025 made India the world's fourth largest economy. But getting the engine running turned out to be the easier half of the problem. What happens to everyone riding in the car is the harder half, and that's the harder half that this video is going to address. Growth alone doesn't fix this. The reasons come down to how work actually turns into income, and three of those things or three of those facelets actually go on to matter the most. The first, not all work produces the same value per hour, and the gap can actually go on to become enormous. Picture a farmer whose main tools are a monsoon he can't predict and a plot of land too small to justify a tractor purchase. Now, on the other hand, picture an office worker whose tools are electricity, a fast network, and machines built on decades of somebody else's investment and hard work. Both of them just work as hard, but one produces many times more value per hour. The difference comes from what each has to work with, not with the sheer effort alone. Something close to half of India's workforce is still in the first kind of job. Together, they produce like a sixth of the country's total income. Half of the workforce and a sixth of the country's income. That mismatch, ladies and gentlemen, goes on to explain more about ordinary Indian poverty than almost any polity debate can substantially do. Now, the textbook fix for this particular issue is that workers move from the first kind of job to the second one, and it sounds very simple, right? Just like how South Korea, Taiwan, and China all did at real speed. Now, India's own government estimates that it needs to create close to 8 million of these better jobs every single year just to keep pace with the workers trying to make that switch or that move. And in some recent years, it hasn't even come close. The second reason is something that is far more interesting and connected to ground reality: uncertainty. Most new jobs in India come without a written contract, paid leave, or any guarantee of next month's income. Something like 8 or 9 in every Indian workers actually go on to fall into this category today as and when I speak. This matters more than it actually seems. When you don't know whether you will be paid next month, you stop planning for next year. You don't take a loan to grow a small business. You don't move your family somewhere with a better school. Uncertainty doesn't just make people poorer in the moment, it also makes their long term thinking a luxury only the secure can actually go on to afford. That, as much as low income itself, is what keeping millions of families in India standing still. The third reason is the gap between presence and progress. Well, over 95% of Indian children are now enrolled in school. That problem is close to solved, but a recent national survey found that roughly half the children finishing 5th grade still couldn't fluently read a paragraph written for a child 2 years younger. A classroom can guarantee a seat. It can't guarantee that anything is actually landing. And for years, Indian education policy measured success by how many children walked through the door. Only recently has it started measuring what happens after they sit down. And that shift, ladies and gentlemen, might matter more than almost anything else in this video. Chapter 4 raises a deeper question. Why do some countries close gaps like this faster than others? In 2024, the Nobel Prize in Economics went to three researchers: Darren, Simon Johnsons, and James Robinson, for an answer that actually became hard to ignore for any country, which is a country's institution or institutions in a country matter more than almost anything else that the country actually has to offer. Not resources, not culture, institutions. Meaning the actual rules for who can own property, enforce a contract, or even start a business, and how many people those rules genuinely include. It isn't an uncontested idea, and it's something that's discussed very widely, right? South Korea and Taiwan both grew explosively without building that kind of an institution first, which suggests institution may matter more for sustaining prosperity across generations than for just igniting it in the first place. But it's the best single explanation anyone has for why some countries turn effort into lasting prosperity and others fundamentally fail to do so. Think of institutions as an operating system. A brilliant idea, a hard-working family, a good harvest. Each one is an application running on top of that system. If the operating system itself is slow or absolutely unreliable, it doesn't matter how good the application actually is, it still runs slowly and ultimately and unfortunately it goes on to crash. Consider what is this mean to own land in much of India. More than 50 million cases are actually sitting in Indian courts right now. Some are a decade older. Now, a farmer with a legitimate claim to inherit land doesn't really have secure property if proving that claim takes longer than his entire working life. The deed is real. The security isn't supposed to provide. It isn't supposed to until someone can enforce it in a reasonable amount of time. that operating system isn't uniform across the country. India isn't one economy, it's 28 different states which is running slightly different versions of the same systems for decades now. States that invested early and consistently in health and education, states such as Kerala, Tamil Nadu now look statistically closer to a middle income country than to the national average combined. Others are a full generation behind on the same measures. Encouragingly, that gap has started narrowing with the fastest progress coming from the states that started the furthest behind. And in this case, I'm talking about states like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and Madhya Pradesh. One more layer belongs in this chapter, and it actually deserves to be named, not skipped: caste. Decades of households survey data studied by economists across different fields consistently show that even after accounting for identical education and identical qualification, caste still correlates with who gets the loan, who inherits the land, and who gets access to the right kind of networks. It isn't the whole explanation for anything in this video, but it's a real durable part of the entire operating system that we are trying to decode. One more reason the same effort in the same country doesn't always go on to produce the same kind of results. And I can put my hand on my heart and say this, that a lot of you watching this video might agree to what I just mentioned. Everything so far has described systems, and it's actually worth remembering these systems and giving a point of reflection to go on to acknowledge that all of this are made of individual lives. The five people ahead are composites, not real individuals. The pattern they represent matters more than any one single name that I'm going to take, so please pay very close attention. Picture Meena. She farms just under 2 acres in rural Madhya Pradesh, close to the median size for an Indian small holding. Her income depends on a monsoon she can't predict and prices she can't set. A good season barely clears the debt from the last poor one. She is one of hundreds of millions of Indians for whom employed and financially secure turn out to be 20 entirely different worlds. Picture Ramesh. He left a village in Bihar for construction work in Delhi. He's paid daily in cash with no contract and no employer who's actually trying to return to once the current building is actually finished. He is one of the workers keeping India's visible boom in roads and towers running, and almost entirely invisible in the statistics people quote about that particular boom. Picture Sunita. She runs a small tailoring shop from a rented storefront, and for her, the new India is real. She takes digital payment instead of digital transfers now. No bank visits required, and it's genuinely grown her customer base immensely. But a loan to expand the shop is still hard to get on reasonable terms. She's proof that infrastructure can move fast in this country, and also proof that access to money isn't caught up with access to payments. Now, picture Anil. He teaches at a government primary school where two grades share one room. Sometimes, with just one teacher, getting children into his classroom is no longer the hard part. Nearly all of them show up now. Getting every single one of them reading fluently by the time they leave is actually the hardest part, and which is actually a much slower work than it looks on paper, videos, and mainstream media. And it's the work he's now being asked to do. Picture Priya. She finished an engineering degree and now works as a customer support job that doesn't use it, applying mostly without a reply for something closer to what she was trained for. She isn't part of any poverty statistics in this video, but by income, she's actually doing far better than most of the country. But she represents something just as central to it: the gap between how many qualified young people in this country are actually produced every single year and how many well matched jobs it has ready for them to take up and start their careers. None of these five are unusual. Multiply each of them by tens or hundreds of millions, and you still have most of this video told from ground level instead of just a spreadsheet or looking at various articles that news channels have blindly gone on to publish. It would be a dishonest to actually stop here. An enormous amount has genuinely improved, and the last few chapters and the insights can start to sound like indictment, right? That isn't the intent. Start with a number from chapter 2. Something like a quarter of 2 billion people have moved out of the most severe poverty in under a decade. Independent researchers using entirely different methods arrive at a similar scale of this particular change and development. However, you measure it, this is one of the largest movements of people out of destitution ever recorded in any country in any decade possible. Then there's the infrastructure most people never see because it works quietly in the background of an ordinary transaction. A decade ago, most Indian adults had no bank account. Close to 580 million accounts have been opened since then. On top of that base, India's real-time payment system now moves more transaction than any comparable system on earth. It isn't a private company chasing profit, it's public infrastructure built the way a road or power line actually is built for citizens to actually consume. Combined with near universal digital identity, its measurability actually reduced how much of a government's subsidy gets lost on its way from the treasury to an actual family. Village electrification is now close to universal. Life expectancy is at an all-time record high. And on the Global Innovation Index, a ranking of a country's research and entrepreneurial output, India has climbed from 66th place in 2019 to 38th place in 2025. Now first among very few lower middle income countries to actually go on to secure that particular spot. None of that is a small story and none of that should be actually discarded. It means daily life of hundreds of millions of Indians is measurably better than it was 10 years ago. This is the pivot the rest of the video turns on. Growth in infrastructure created the possibility of broad prosperity. They didn't automatically deliver it, it turned out easier to build the pipes that move money at extraordinary speed than to make sure every child can actually read, every willing woman can safely work, and every small business can get a fair loan. That gap between what's been built and what's actually reached everyone is what this video was just trying to address. If there was one clear fix, someone would have already applied it. What exists instead is a handful of real trade-offs, each with a genuine cost and a group of people it would unsettle. On education, the fix everyone can now name is foundational literacy over enrollment, and it's already underway with early signs of recovering reading scores. The catch? Retraining and holding accountable millions of teachers across one of the largest school systems on the planet is a decade-long project and not just a budget cycle that we have to go ahead and evaluate every single year. It will look frustratingly slow even when it's actually quietly working in the background. On the institutions front, the fix is more judges, faster courts, and more disputes resolved outside a courtroom entirely through mediation, and all of it costs money and takes years before anybody can actually feel the real difference. But every year of delay is another year that legitimate ownership and legitimate deals stay harder to enforce than they should be. On the jobs front, the fix is turning informal work into formal work, contracts, benefits, a predictable wage. Largely, that means connecting vocational training directly to real employers, closer to how Germany actually did it. So a credential, reliable lead actually leads to a job instead of just an additional line on a resume that absolutely nobody goes on to value. On the agricultural front, the fix is letting farmers consolidate small plots and shift toward high value crops. It's also the hardest fix politically. For a family with almost nothing else, land isn't just a productive asset to be optimized for, it's their savings. It's their account, it's their entire account, and it's their life's entire security in one asset. That kind of reforms moves at the speed of trust and not at the speed of unit economics for every single government to actually optimize for. On the inclusions front, cities and roughly half the population that's female, the fix is investment that shows up in no single ministry's headline budget, safer transportation, childcare, urban planning built for growth that's already coming and that's already underway. Sure, more than almost anywhere else in the video, it matters to ask why a number is moving, not just which direction, right? More women have entered paid work over the last few years, but researchers who have observed this very closely found much of that rise was rural women returning to farm labor during a period of economic strain, not the arrival of safer, better paid jobs that would actually make the gain very durable. A rising number and a real improvement aren't automatically the same thing, and it's fundamental that we go on to acknowledge this particular insight. No lever here fixes the whole puzzle by itself. Each one has a real cost, a timeline measured in years rather than headlines or every year's budget, and someone who benefits from things staying exactly as they are. This isn't clinicism, right? It's what change actually looks like at scale in a country that is bigger than most country on the planet in terms of population, of course. So, why is India still poor? By now, the honest answer is that it's the wrong question to ask, or at least an unfinished one. The more useful question is why growth and everyday security haven't traveled at the same speed to the same places and for the same number of people. The answer was never 1 million, one hero, or one policy. It's colonial era damage that took decades just to begin repairing, then decades of more loss to control room trying to run an entire economy by itself, then 30 years of real growth that solved the size of the pie chart faster than it solved how fairly and how quickly that pie actually reaches to everyone with a claim of that particular slice. India's future won't be decided by a single election or a single budget. However, much each one gets covered will be a part of it. It'll be decided by whether a court can resolve a land dispute in months instead of years, right? Whether a village classroom can turn attendance into actual reading, whether a family's savings can survive one bad diagnosis, whether a woman can take a job without doing a safety calculation first. Institutions compounding over decades, not a headline over a news cycle that everybody goes on to discuss every single day with no absolute sense or direction. Go back to the two girls from the starting, right? What India does over the next 20 years won't be measured by whether one of them becomes spectacularly successful. It'll be measured by whether the accident of which village, which hospital, which state they were actually born in stops deciding almost statistically everything that goes on to happen to that one particular girl next. What kind of institutions, opportunities, and investments would it actually take to move hundreds of millions of people from surviving to secure? That's not a hopeless question, it's actually an unfinished one. And for a country this size, unfinished might be the most honest and the most hopeful word anybody can go on to use.